The sky above the eastern front was not just blue, it was a canvas of contradictions, painted in shades of hope and despair, life and death, all blending together in the frozen vastness that stretched from horizon to horizon. In that immeasurable expanse, where the cold bit through leather and metal alike, where the breath of engines mixed with the breath of men, there flew a young pilot who would become legend. His name was Erich Hartmann, though the men who flew beside him called him Booby, the boy, and the enemies who hunted him whispered a different name altogether, Czerny Chort, the Black Devil. But before he was legend, before he was ace, before he was anything but a trembling hand on a control stick, he was simply a young man who understood one fundamental truth about survival. The sky forgives nothing, and neither does war. October 1942. The month carried the weight of autumn, that particular heaviness when the world prepares to die before being reborn. Hartmann's hands, still smooth and uncalloused by the rigors of combat, gripped the throttle of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 for his very first combat mission. 20 years old, with blonde hair that caught the light and eyes that had not yet learned to see death coming, he sat in the cockpit, breathing through his mouth, because his nose couldn't quite manage the task alone. Fear has a taste, metallic and sharp, and he knew it well that morning. His wingman was Edmund Rossmann, called Pale by everyone who knew him, a veteran whose voice crackled through the radio with the casual authority of someone who had already died 1,000 deaths, and somehow kept on living. The mission briefing had been simple. Patrol Sector 7, engage enemy aircraft if encountered, return to base. Simple words for something that was never simple. Hartmann's Messerschmitt climbed through layers of cloud, and he remembered his mother's hands on the control stick of a glider when he was just a boy, the way she had shown him how to feel the air, to sense its moods and currents as if they were living things. But this was different. This machine beneath him was not a gentle sailplane catching thermals over Württemberg. This was a predator, armed with cannons and machine guns, designed for one purpose only, and somewhere above or below or behind or ahead, other predators waited. They found them 30 minutes into the patrol. 10 aircraft, dark specks against white clouds, Soviet fighters on their way to somewhere that didn't matter because they would never arrive. Hartmann's heart accelerated, matching the rhythm of the Daimler-Benz engine that thundered in front of him. This was it. This was the moment he had trained for, the moment that every young pilot imagines, in the safety of his bed at night, seeing himself victorious, seeing himself immortal. He opened the throttle without thinking, without waiting for Rossmann's command, without remembering any of the tactical lessons beaten into him during training. The Messerschmitt surged forward, separating from his wingman, diving toward a Soviet fighter that grew larger in his windscreen, with terrifying speed. Distance collapsed. The enemy aircraft filled his vision, close enough to see the rivets in its fuselage, close enough to see the pilot's head moving in the cockpit. Hartmann pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. He pressed again. Still nothing. He had forgotten to arm his weapons. The realization came with a cold wash of horror, and in that same instant, the Soviet pilot saw him, pulled hard into a turning climb, and Hartmann, overcorrecting, felt his own aircraft shudder and slip, nearly colliding with the enemy machine as it flashed past, close enough to see the red star painted on its side. He pulled back on the stick, too hard, too fast, and the Messerschmitt bucked and fought him, the world spinning in a nauseating whirl of earth and sky and cloud, until he finally recovered, alone in an empty sky, his wingman gone, the enemy gone, and only the sound of his own breathing filling the cockpit. He flew for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, searching for something familiar, some landmark that would guide him home. The fuel gauge was dropping, the needle sweeping downward with merciless consistency. He had been so focused on not dying that he had forgotten to watch his fuel consumption, forgotten to think about anything except survival. The engine coughed once, a small interruption in its steady roar, and Hartmann felt his stomach drop. It coughed again. The needle on the fuel gauge touched empty. The engine died, And suddenly the Messerschmitt was not a fighter aircraft but a glider, and all those childhood lessons came flooding back as he searched frantically for a place to land. Any place. A field, a road, a stretch of flat ground that wouldn't kill him. He found a clearing. It wasn't much, barely long enough, surrounded by trees that reached up like fingers, waiting to grab him and pull him down. But it was all he had. The Messerschmitt came in low and fast, too fast, and the ground rushed up to meet him. And then impact, the terrible grinding crunch of metal on earth, the aircraft bouncing once, twice, sliding sideways, and finally, mercifully, stopping. Silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of survival, punctuated only by the ticking of cooling metal and his own ragged breathing. He had survived his first combat mission. He had not shot down any enemies. He had not covered himself in glory. He had run out of fuel and crashed his aircraft in a field somewhere on the Eastern Front. This was war. This was reality. This was the beginning. The men at the base did not cheer when he returned, muddy and exhausted, brought back by a search party that had spent hours looking for him. Hubertus von Bohnen, his squadron commander, listened to his report with an expression that could have been carved from stone. The older man's eyes, gray as winter clouds, held neither anger nor disappointment, but something worse, a kind of patient understanding that this is what happened to young pilots who thought they knew everything. Von Bohnen had seen it before. He would see it again. The only question was whether the young pilot would learn from his mistakes or become another name in the casualty reports. 3 days working with the ground crew, that was his punishment. 3 days of cleaning oil from engine cowlings, of checking ammunition feeds, of torquing bolts to exact specifications, of learning in the most direct way possible that every aircraft was maintained by the sweat and dedication of men whose names nobody would ever remember. These men, the mechanics and armorers and fuel handlers, worked through nights when pilots slept, worked in cold that made metal burn to touch, worked with hands that were perpetually stained with grease and oil and sometimes blood. They took apart engines and put them back together with the knowledge that a single mistake, a single loose connection or improperly installed component could mean a pilot's death. Hartmann worked alongside a mechanic named Klaus, a man in his 40s with hands like leather and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work. Klaus didn't say much at first, just demonstrated tasks and expected Hartmann to follow along. How to properly clean spark plugs, checking each one for wear and carbon buildup. How to inspect fuel lines for cracks or leaks that might not be visible but could be felt with experienced fingers. How to load ammunition belts, ensuring that each round seated properly, that the mix of armor-piercing and high explosive was correct, that the feed mechanism moved smoothly without binding. These were not glamorous tasks. These were not the stuff of propaganda films or medal ceremonies. But these were the tasks that kept pilots alive. On the second day, Klaus finally spoke more than instructions. They were working on an engine cowling, removing it to access the engine itself, and Klaus said quietly, without looking at Hartmann, that the pilot who usually flew this aircraft had been killed 2 weeks earlier. Engine fire at low altitude. No time to bail out. The aircraft had been repaired, the engine replaced, but Klaus still checked it 3 times before he would sign off on it being airworthy. Because that's what you did. You checked and you double-checked and sometimes you triple-checked, because a pilot's life depended on your work being perfect, not just good enough, but perfect. Hartmann said nothing, just kept working. But the lesson settled into his bones deeper than any lecture could have reached. On the 3rd day, his last day of punishment, Hartmann was helping to replace a damaged propeller when he noticed something. One of the mounting bolts had threads that looked slightly worn. Nothing obvious, nothing that would fail immediately, but wear nonetheless. He pointed it out to Klaus, who examined it, grunted approval, and replaced the bolt with a new one. That evening, Klaus told him that he would make a good pilot if he learned to be as careful in the air as he was learning to be on the ground. It was the closest thing to a compliment Hartmann had received since arriving at the squadron. and it meant more to him than any medal ever would. And those 3 days taught him more than all his training combined. They taught him humility, the understanding that he was not the lone hero of his own story, but one part of a larger machine where everyone's role mattered. They taught him respect for the men whose work was invisible until something went wrong, who received no glory but carried the weight of responsibility every day. They taught him that survival was not about heroism, but about preparation, about understanding every rivet and wire and system in the machine that stood between him and the earth. Most importantly, they taught him to think like a mechanic as well as a pilot, to listen to the engine's voice, to feel vibrations that shouldn't be there, to notice small anomalies before they became catastrophic failures. 22 days later, he got his first victory. An Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, the flying tank, the terror of German ground forces, fell to his guns and spun down into the snow, trailing black smoke. He felt nothing like triumph. He felt only a strange emptiness, a realization that somewhere on the ground, a man like him, perhaps younger, perhaps with a family waiting, had just died. But the emptiness could not last, because war did not allow such luxuries. There were always more missions, always more enemies, always more chances to die, or to kill, or simply to survive another day. The forced landings became a pattern, a strange rhythm to his war, each one unique in its terror and its lessons. 16 times his aircraft would fail him, and 16 times the story was different, but always ended the same way, with him walking away from twisted metal that should have been his grave. Each forced landing etched itself into his memory with crystalline clarity, the kind of detail that trauma burns into the mind. In January 1943, his engine seized over frozen fields near Mariupol during what should have been a routine patrol. The sound, or rather the absence of sound, that moment when the steady roar of the Daimler-Benz engine suddenly stopped and was replaced by the wind whistling through the cockpit and the blood pounding in his ears. He had been at 8,000 feet when it happened, which gave him perhaps 3 minutes to find a place to land. The earth below was white, covered in snow that made everything look flat and featureless, hiding ditches and fences and all the small obstacles that could turn a forced landing into a fatal crash. He chose a field that looked smooth, lined up his approach, adjusted for the crosswind that was stronger than he liked, and brought the Messerschmitt down with the kind of precision that only comes from having done this before, though never in conditions like these. The snow was deeper than it appeared from altitude, and the aircraft didn't slide across it so much as plow into it, the snow rising up around the fuselage like a frozen wave, building higher and higher until it covered the bottom half of the cockpit, until Hartmann couldn't see anything but white through the forward windscreen. The aircraft finally stopped, nose down, tail up, and for a long moment Hartmann just sat there, breathing, listening to the silence, before he realized that his hands were still gripping the control stick so tightly that his fingers had gone numb. In March, during a mission near Kerch, a Soviet fighter's debris, pieces of wing and fuselage, torn apart by his cannon fire, struck his own aircraft with the force of a sledgehammer. He felt the impact through the airframe, heard the terrible sound of metal tearing, and then smelled the distinctive odor of hot oil as his oil cooler ruptured. The oil temperature gauge began climbing immediately, the needle sweeping upward into the red zone and beyond. He had maybe 5 minutes before the engine seized from overheating, maybe 10 if he was lucky. He throttled back, sacrificing speed for engine life, and aimed for the nearest friendly airfield, which according to his map was 20 kilometers away, a distance that suddenly seemed infinite. The engine began to knock, a deep, rhythmic hammering that he could feel through the rudder pedals, through the stick, through his entire body. The temperature gauge pegged at maximum. Smoke began seeping into the cockpit, not the black smoke of fire but the gray-white smoke of burning oil, acrid and choking. Hartmann opened the canopy slightly to vent the smoke, and the wind tore at his face, numbing his cheeks and making his eyes water. The airfield appeared ahead, a brown scar on the white landscape, and he had just enough altitude to make it if the engine held together for another minute. 30 seconds. Please, just 30 more seconds. The engine seized when he was half a mile out, the propeller stopping so suddenly that the aircraft shuddered like a living thing in its death throes. But he had altitude, and he had airspeed, and he had done this before. He glided in, trading height for distance, fighting the controls that felt wrong without engine power to help, and crossed the airfield boundary with perhaps 50 feet to spare. The landing was hard, harder than he wanted, the shock jarring his spine and making his teeth click together. But he was down, and he was alive, and the aircraft had once again refused to kill him despite having every reason to do so. In May, during the chaos of the Battle of Kursk, where the sky was so full of aircraft that pilots joked about needing traffic lights, his landing gear refused to extend. He cycled the hydraulics again and again, listening for the sound of the gear deploying, feeling for the slight drag that indicated the wheels were down. Nothing. The hydraulic system, damaged by ground fire he hadn't even noticed during the mission, had bled out somewhere over the battlefield. He had two choices: bail out, which meant landing by parachute in the middle of an active combat zone, or belly land the aircraft, which meant destroying it, but potentially saving his own life. He chose the belly landing, circling the airfield while he ran through the checklist in his mind, preparing himself for what was coming. The key was to keep the nose up as long as possible, to touch down on the belly first and let the aircraft settle gently, not to let the propeller hit the ground while it was still spinning, because that would flip the aircraft and probably kill him. He made his approach slower than normal, conserving energy, keeping the nose high, and when the belly touched the grass runway, sparks flew up around him like a meteor shower, streaming behind the aircraft in a trail of fire and smoke. The sound was unbelievable. Metal grinding on earth, the shriek of the airframe being destroyed, and then mercifully it was over, the aircraft sliding to a stop, and Hartmann sitting in the cockpit thinking that this was becoming entirely too familiar. Each landing was different. Each one taught him something new about physics and probability, and the thin line between life and death. He learned that an aircraft could absorb more punishment than anyone imagined if you knew how to distribute the impact, how to bleed off speed, how to find the softest possible angle between metal and earth. He learned to read terrain from altitude, to distinguish between firm ground and bog, between snow that would support an aircraft and snow that would swallow it. He learned that trees could be sheared off by wings without killing the pilot if you hit them just right, if you caught them at the thickest part of the wing where the structure was strongest. He learned that snow was better than dirt, dirt better than rock, and that water, despite what everyone thought, was the worst of all, because you couldn't see what lay beneath the surface, whether it was a meter deep or 10 meters deep, whether the bottom was sand or rock or submerged debris that would tear the aircraft apart. He learned these lessons with his body, with bruised ribs that made it hurt to breathe for weeks afterward, with wrenched shoulders that took months to heal properly, with a tooth that he swallowed during a particularly hard landing that left him tasting blood for an hour, sitting in a medical tent while a doctor examined his mouth and assured him that he would be fine. That teeth could be replaced, but pilots couldn't. Each forced landing added to his education, teaching him things that couldn't be learned from books or lectures or even from other pilots' experiences. They had to be lived, had to be felt, had to be survived. But through all of it, through every forced landing and emergency and moment of absolute terror, one fact remained unchanged, and somehow miraculous. No enemy pilot ever shot him down in combat. Not once. Not ever. They tried. God knows they tried. Hundreds of Soviet pilots fired at him. Thousands of rounds were aimed at his aircraft. Tracer fire that looked like chains of light reaching across the sky to grab him. Cannon shells that exploded close enough to rock his aircraft with their concussion. But none of them succeeded in bringing him down. Every one of his 16 forced landings was due to mechanical failure or damage from debris of aircraft he had just destroyed, never from enemy fire that successfully targeted him in the heat of combat. The Soviet pilots learned his radio call sign, Karaya 1, and when they heard it crackling through the static on their radios, Some of them broke off and ran, unwilling to face the Black Devil. The Soviet command put a price on his head, 10,000 rubles. Enough money to make a man rich. Enough to buy a future in a country where most people had nothing. But nobody collected it, not because the bounty wasn't tempting, but because Hartmann was not there to be shot down. He was there to shoot down others, and he did it with a methodical precision that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with mathematics and patience and an almost supernatural ability to read the flow of combat. His mentor, Rossmann, had taught him the most important lesson, the one that kept you alive when courage got you killed. See, decide, attack, break away. 4 simple words that contained the essence of survival. C meant maintaining constant awareness, rotating your head continuously to scan every quadrant of sky, checking your 6 o'clock position so often it became unconscious reflex. In combat, the enemy you didn't see was the one who killed you. Decide meant evaluating the tactical situation with ruthless honesty, calculating odds, measuring your advantages and disadvantages, choosing whether to engage or to wait for a better opportunity. Attack meant committing fully once the decision was made, using speed and surprise and position to maximize your chances of success. Break away meant never staying in the fight longer than necessary, never getting drawn into extended combat where luck mattered more than skill, using your attack run to build up speed and escape before anyone could respond. Never dogfight, never enter into the swirling melee where skill and luck blurred together and any stray bullet could end you. The traditional image of aerial combat, 2 fighters circling each other in an ever-tightening spiral, each pilot trying to get on the other's tail, trading altitude for turn radius, burning fuel and ammunition in a contest that often ended with both aircraft exhausted and vulnerable. Hartmann avoided this kind of fighting the way a prudent man avoids bar fights. It was romantic, it was exciting, it was also stupid. Instead, he practiced what the Americans would later call boom and zoom tactics, though he learned it from Rossmann, who had learned it from necessity after injuring his arm and finding that he couldn't sustain the physical strain of dogfighting. The method was simple in concept, but required discipline to execute. Climb high, wait for the perfect moment. Dive down out of the sun, with gravity adding to your speed, close to point-blank range, where missing was almost impossible. Fire a burst that lasted no more than 2 or 3 seconds, and immediately break away, using your accumulated speed to escape before the enemy formation could react. It was not glamorous. It was not the romantic vision of aerial combat that young boys imagined, that propaganda films portrayed, that the public expected. It was efficient. It was effective. It was the difference between an ace and a dead man. Hartmann refined the method even further based on his own experience and observations. He would often wait until he was so close to the enemy aircraft that it filled his entire windscreen, close enough to see individual panel lines, close enough that his pilots later joked that he was trying to collect enemy aircraft pieces in his radiator. This extreme close range served 2 purposes. First, it made aiming almost irrelevant. At 50 meters or less, you didn't need to calculate deflection or lead the target. You pointed and fired, and the shells went exactly where you aimed them. Second, it ensured that when you hit, you destroyed completely. There were no wounded aircraft limping home, no pilots surviving with stories about the German fighter that shot at them. There was only destruction, sudden and total. The enemy aircraft disintegrating in a fireball or breaking apart under the impact of 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun rounds. The drawback to this method, the price Hartmann paid for his effectiveness, was that he often flew through the debris field of the aircraft he had just destroyed. Pieces of wing, fragments of fuselage, sometimes entire engines torn from their mounts, all traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour and capable of inflicting serious damage on his own aircraft. Multiple times his windscreen was cracked by debris impacts. Several times his wings were dented or punctured. Once, memorably, a piece of propeller blade from a destroyed Soviet fighter embedded itself in his engine cowling, and he flew the entire mission back to base, with it sticking out like a knife in a wound, not knowing until he landed that it had come within centimeters of severing his oil line. This was why, despite never being shot down by enemy fire, he was forced to land 16 times due to damage. The debris from his own kills became his greatest enemy, the unavoidable consequence of his chosen tactics. But he accepted this trade-off because the alternative, engaging at longer range and accepting a lower kill probability, meant spending more time in combat, which increased the chance that some lucky shot would find him. Better to risk damage from debris than risk being shot by an enemy pilot who got lucky. The tulip came in the spring of 1944, a black tulip painted on the engine cowling of his Messerschmitt, a personal insignia that made him instantly recognizable. It lasted for 6 missions before he had it removed, because the Soviet pilots, seeing that distinctive marking, would not engage, and his kill rate dropped to nothing. There was a lesson in that too. Fear was a weapon, but only if you could hide it until the moment of attack. The black tulip was too honest, too forthright. It announced his presence when what he needed was invisibility, the ability to be just another Messerschmitt in the formation until the instant he wanted to be seen. By the summer of 1944, his score had climbed beyond 200, then past 250, then toward 300. Numbers that seemed impossible, that made other pilots shake their heads in disbelief. But Hartmann knew the truth behind the numbers. They were not a measure of skill alone. They were a measure of opportunity. The Eastern Front was a target-rich environment, as the American pilots would say, filled with Soviet aircraft flown by pilots whose training measured in hours, while his measured in years. It was not fair. War is never fair. He had simply learned to exploit the unfairness with ruthless efficiency. August 20th, 1943. This date remained burned into his memory, not because of what he achieved, but because of what nearly ended him. His aircraft, damaged by debris during an attack on Il-2 Sturmovix, lost power over Soviet-held territory, and he had no choice but to put it down behind enemy lines. The landing was hard but survivable, the Messerschmitt carving a furrow through a wheat field before coming to rest against a line of trees. He sat in the cockpit for a moment, breathing hard, checking himself for injuries. Nothing broken, nothing bleeding. Just the knowledge that he was now in the worst possible situation, a German pilot alone in Soviet territory with soldiers who would very much like to capture or kill him. He climbed out of the cockpit and ran, leaving the aircraft behind, heading toward what he hoped was west, toward German lines. The wheat was tall, golden in the late summer sun, and he moved through it like a swimmer, through water, pushing stalks aside, leaving a trail that anyone could follow. Behind him, he heard shouting in Russian, the sound of men organizing a search. He ran faster, his flight boots awkward on the uneven ground, his lungs burning with the effort. They were getting closer. He could hear individual voices now, commands being barked, the sound of vehicles approaching. There was nowhere to hide in the open field, nowhere to run that they couldn't follow. So he stopped running and made a choice that probably saved his life. He lay down in the wheat and began to moan, clutching his stomach, making the sounds of a man dying from internal injuries. When the Soviet soldiers found him, they saw exactly what he wanted them to see: a wounded pilot, no threat, someone who needed to be transported back to a field hospital for interrogation. They put him on a stretcher, loaded him into a truck, and began driving. Hartmann lay there, eyes half closed, listening to their conversation in a language he didn't understand, waiting for his moment. It came when the truck slowed to navigate a rough section of road. He rolled off the stretcher, hit the truck bed hard, scrambled to his feet, and jumped over the tailgate, landing in a ditch and rolling, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but not stopping him. He ran again, this time into woods, with bullets cracking past him, splintering bark from trees, but none finding their mark. He ran for hours, using the sun to guide him west, until finally, exhausted, dehydrated, he stumbled into German lines, where soldiers nearly shot him before recognizing his uniform. 3 days later, after being debriefed and examined by a doctor who found nothing worse than bruises and dehydration, he was back in the cockpit. His ground crew chief, Heinz Mertens, the man who maintained his aircraft with obsessive dedication, checked every system twice before letting him fly. Mertens was another reason for Hartmann's survival, a mechanic who understood that a pilot's life depended on things like properly torqued bolts and correctly adjusted fuel mixtures. The relationship between pilot and mechanic was marriage without romance, partnership built on mutual dependence. Hartmann trusted Mertens with his life every time he climbed into the cockpit, and Mertens took that responsibility seriously enough to lose sleep over it. The war ground on through autumn and into winter. Hartmann flew missions in conditions that would ground modern air forces, taking off in snowstorms, landing on icy runways, fighting in temperatures so cold that the gun lubricant froze solid and had to be warmed before the weapons would fire. The Eastern Front in winter was a special kind of hell, where metal became brittle, where engines refused to start, where frostbite was as much an enemy as Soviet fighters. He learned to pour fuel into the oil reservoir to thin it enough to flow in the cold. He learned to build fires under the engine to warm it before attempting to start. He learned all the small tricks that kept men alive when the temperature dropped to 30 below zero. On his 22nd birthday, April 19, 1944, he woke in a bunk that smelled of leather and aviation fuel and unwashed bodies, all the smells of war compressed into a space too small for the number of men who had to share it. There was no celebration, no cake, no gifts. There was only a mission briefing, the same as every other day, and after the briefing he walked to his aircraft through mud that sucked at his boots, and he flew, and he fought, and he returned, and that was the entirety of his birthday. War did not care about birthdays or holidays or any of the markers that civilian life used to measure time. War had its own calendar, measured in missions flown and missions survived. May 21st, 1944. The date marked his first encounter with American aircraft, defending the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. P-51 Mustangs, sleek and fast and flown by pilots who had the luxury of months of training and unlimited fuel for practice. The engagement was brief and violent, and Hartmann found himself fighting in a way he rarely fought, trading speed and altitude for position, caught in the kind of dogfight he usually avoided. His fuel gauge dropped toward empty faster than it should have, and he realized that one of the Mustangs had put holes in his fuselage. That fuel was streaming out behind him in an invisible vapor trail. He broke off, diving away, heading for home with the engine coughing as it tried to suck fuel from tanks that were nearly empty. The landing was hard, the Messerschmitt floating longer than it should have because he was so light, and when he finally touched down and taxied to a stop, his hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to undo his harness straps. The mechanic who examined his aircraft found 17 bullet holes, none of them critical individually, but together they had nearly ended him. Hartmann stood there, looking at the damage, understanding how close he had come to becoming a statistic, and feeling something he rarely allowed himself to feel: fear. Not the momentary fear of combat, the adrenaline rush that sharpened reflexes and heightened senses, but the deeper fear that comes with understanding how random survival really is. The bullets that hit his aircraft were inches away from hitting his fuel tank, from hitting his oil cooler, from hitting him. Inches. The difference between life and death, measured in inches. 1 week later, he ran out of fuel again, this time during a dogfight with Mustangs that lasted too long, that drew him too far from friendly airfields. The engine quit at 4,000 feet, and he glided toward what he hoped was a suitable landing spot, a road or a field or anything flat. What he found was a forest clearing, barely large enough for a bicycle, let alone a Messerschmitt. He went in anyway because there was no choice, threading between trees that scraped his wings and tore pieces from his aircraft, and somehow, impossibly, he got it down without dying. The American pilot who had been chasing him, Lieutenant Robert Goebel, circled overhead after Hartmann bailed out, making a pass so close that Hartmann could see the pilot's face behind his oxygen mask. Goebel waved as he flew past, a gesture between warriors that transcended nationality, acknowledging survival rather than celebrating victory. August 24th, 1944. The day of days. The day when everything came together, when skill and opportunity and luck aligned in a way that would never happen again. 11 aircraft destroyed in 2 missions, a double ace in a single day, bringing his total to 301 confirmed victories. The number seemed impossible even to him, sitting in the cockpit after the second mission, watching his hands shake with exhaustion as ground crew swarmed over the aircraft. 301. He was 22 years old. 301 men had died because of him. 301 aircraft had fallen from the sky under his guns, and he felt nothing like triumph, nothing like glory. He felt tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't cure. They awarded him the Diamonds of the Knight's Cross, one of only 27 men to receive Germany's highest military decoration. He was summoned to Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters hidden in the forests of East Prussia. Security was intense in the aftermath of the July 20th assassination attempt, and Hartmann was required to surrender his sidearm before entering. According to some accounts, he refused, threatening to decline the award if he couldn't be trusted with a pistol. According to other accounts, he surrendered it without protest. The truth, like so much in war, depends on who tells the story. What is certain is that he met Adolf Hitler, shook his hand, received the diamonds, and later had a conversation about pilot training that Hitler admitted was pointless because, as the Führer said with uncharacteristic honesty, the war was already lost. The award came with 10 days leave, 10 days to return to Germany and marry Ursula Paich, his childhood sweetheart, who had waited for him through all the years of war. The wedding was simple, attended by a few friends including Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest scoring ace of the war, and Wilhelm Batz. They drank champagne that was not very good and ate cake that was even worse. And for a few hours, Hartmann was not a fighter pilot but simply a young man marrying the woman he loved. Then the leave ended, and he returned to the war. And Ursula returned to waiting, as she had waited before and would wait again, not knowing if each goodbye was the final one. The winter of 1944-45 was the worst of the war. The Soviet offensive ground forward with relentless momentum, pushing the German forces back toward the Reich itself. Airfields were abandoned in the middle of the night, ground crews destroying aircraft they couldn't take with them, pilots flying evacuation missions that left behind everything except the aircraft and themselves. Hartmann flew until his eyes burned with fatigue, until he couldn't remember the last time he had slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch, until the line between dreams and reality blurred into something that might have been madness if he had let himself think about it too much. In March 1945, Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter pilots, summoned him to Berlin and offered him command of a jet fighter unit flying the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262. The aircraft was everything the Bf 109 was not: fast beyond belief, jet-powered, capable of speeds that made piston fighters obsolete overnight. It was the future of aviation, assuming Germany had a future, which by March 1945 was increasingly doubtful. Hartmann declined the offer. He gave various reasons: loyalty to his unit, unfamiliarity with jet aircraft, a belief that he could better serve on the Eastern Front. The real reason, which he never quite articulated, even to himself, was simpler. He knew his men, he knew his mechanics, he knew his aircraft. The Me-262 was unknown territory, and at this late stage of the war, with defeat inevitable, he chose the devil he knew over the devil he didn't. April 17, 1945. 350 confirmed victories, a number so far beyond anyone else that it stood alone in the record books. The photograph taken that day shows a man who looks older than his 23 years, eyes that have seen too much, a face that has forgotten how to smile naturally. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The only question was how it would end, whether they would be captured by the Soviets or the Western Allies, whether they would survive long enough to be captured at all. May 8, 1945, the last day of the war in Europe. Hartmann flew one final mission, a reconnaissance flight to locate Soviet positions. At 8:30 in the morning, he and his wingmen took off into skies that were strangely quiet, as if both sides were already exhausted by the fighting and simply wanted it to be over. They found Soviet forces only 25 miles from the airfield, close enough that artillery could reach it within hours. On the way back, Hartmann spotted a single Soviet Yak-9, dropped from 12,000 feet, and shot it down, his 352nd and final victory. When he landed and taxied to a stop, he learned that Soviet forces were within artillery range of the airfield. The order came to destroy everything: aircraft, ammunition, fuel, everything that could be used by the enemy. He watched his aircraft burn, the Messerschmitt that had carried him through hundreds of missions, that had absorbed punishment that should have killed him, that had brought him back from 16 forced landings. The flames consumed the cockpit where he had spent so many hours, the wings that had borne him through so much sky, the engine that had sung its deep-throated roar through 3 years of war. Karaya 1 died in fire and smoke, reduced to twisted metal and ash, and with it died something of Hartmann himself, some part of him that had lived only in the air, only in combat, only in the moment of seeing an enemy aircraft in his gun sight. They surrendered to American forces, hoping for better treatment than the Soviets would provide. For 2 days, it seemed they had made the right choice. Then came the order, issued from some distant headquarters, where men made decisions about the fates of thousands, without ever seeing the faces involved. All German forces who had fought on the Eastern Front would be turned over to Soviet custody, as agreed at Yalta. Hartmann and his men were loaded into trucks and driven east, back toward the enemy they had fought for so long, knowing that for them, the war was far from over. The Soviet interrogators wanted him to inform on his fellow prisoners, to betray the men he had fought beside. He refused. They put him in solitary confinement, 4 feet by 9 feet by 6 feet, a concrete box barely large enough to lie down in. He ate bread and water. He slept on bare concrete. He refused to cooperate. They tried different approaches, offering him positions in the East German Air Force, promising him freedom and honors if he would only agree to serve the Soviet-aligned government. He refused. They threatened his wife, claimed they would have her killed. He refused. They beat him during interrogations about his knowledge of jet aircraft. He refused. His method of resistance was simple and absolute. He would rather die than cooperate. The trial, when it finally came, was a formality. He was charged with war crimes, with deliberately shooting 780 Soviet civilians in the village of Bryansk, with attacking a bread factory, with destroying 345 expensive Soviet aircraft. The evidence was non-existent, the charges fabricated, the outcome predetermined. 20 years of hard labor, later increased to 25. He was 23 years old, and they had given him a sentence that would keep him imprisoned until he was 48, assuming he lived that long, which in Soviet labor camps was far from certain. He spent 10 years in various camps and gulags, moving from one frozen hell to another, working when they forced him to work, refusing when he could, enduring solitary confinement so often that he lost track of how many times they locked him in darkness. He organized a prisoner rebellion once, temporarily overpowering the guards and demanding an international inspection and a new trial. The rebellion failed. The trial never came. The international inspection never happened. He was transferred to another camp, spent another 5 months in solitary, and eventually learned that resistance had to be subtle, had to be internal, had to be about maintaining his sense of self in a system designed to erase individuality. His son, Erich Peter, was born in 1945, while Hartmann was already in Soviet custody. The boy died 3 years later without ever meeting his father. Hartmann learned of his son's death months after it happened. The news delivered casually by a guard who thought it might break him. It didn't break him. Nothing could break him because he had already made peace with the possibility of never leaving prison alive, never seeing his wife again, never having a future beyond the walls and fences and guards. He existed in a kind of eternal present, where each day was simply survived rather than lived. 1955. The political landscape had shifted. Stalin was dead. The new Soviet leadership, seeking to normalize relations with West Germany, agreed to release German prisoners of war. On a cold October morning, Hartmann walked out of his final prison camp, thinner than he had been, older than his years, but unbroken in the ways that mattered. He had survived a decade of Soviet imprisonment through the same methods that had kept him alive in the sky above the Eastern Front. See, decide, act, survive. Never surrender, never cooperate. Never give them what they want. He had fought a different kind of battle, one without aircraft or guns or glory, and in his own way, he had won. He returned to West Germany and found a nation he barely recognized, rebuilt from rubble, prosperous in ways that seemed impossible given what he remembered from 1945. His wife was waiting, older now, her face showing the years of waiting and not knowing, but still his Ursula, still the girl he had known in Korntal before the war. They had a daughter, Ursula Isabel, born in 1957, and Hartmann held her with the tentative care of a man who understood how fragile life really was. He rejoined the military, the new Luftwaffe of West Germany, and was given command of Jagdgeschwader 71 Richthofen, the first all-jet fighter wing. The aircraft were Canadair Sabres, later F-104 starfighters, machines that would have seemed like science fiction during his years in a Messerschmitt. But Hartmann, ever the careful professional, saw problems with the F-104 immediately. It was too fast for the training his pilots had, too unforgiving of mistakes, designed for American pilots with thousands of hours of jet experience. He argued against its adoption, wrote reports, made his concerns known through official channels. His concerns were ignored. The aircraft was purchased in large numbers. 269 accidents followed. 116 German pilots died in peacetime crashes. Hartmann's warnings had been proven correct, but by then it was too late, and his insistence on speaking truth to power had made him unpopular with those who made decisions about such things. He was forced into early retirement in 1970 at the age of 48, exactly the age he would have been had he served his full Soviet prison sentence. The irony was not lost on him. He became a civilian flight instructor, teaching young pilots the basics of aviation in small aircraft that were nothing like the machines he had flown in combat. He was patient with his students, demanding but fair, insisting that they understand the principles of flight rather than simply memorizing procedures. He taught them what his mother had taught him decades earlier, in gliders above Württemberg, that flight is not about fighting the air, but about working with it, understanding it, respecting it. September 20th, 1993. Erich Hartmann died in WWII Schönbuch, the same town where he had grown up, where his mother had taught him to fly gliders, where the story had begun 71 years earlier. He was 71 years old, having survived a war that killed millions, survived a decade of Soviet imprisonment, survived the peace that followed, having lived long enough to see the Cold War end, the Berlin Wall fall, and Germany reunited. 4 years after his death, the Russian Federation officially reviewed his case and cleared him of all charges, acknowledging that he had been unjustly convicted, that the war crimes he was accused of had never occurred, that his imprisonment had been political rather than judicial. The final accounting is simple in its brutality. 352 confirmed aerial victories, 1,404 combat missions, 825 aerial engagements, 16 forced landings due to mechanical failure or damage from debris, 0 times shot down in air-to-air combat by enemy fighters. The numbers tell a story, but they don't tell the whole story. They don't capture what it felt like to be 20 years old and terrified, and trying not to show it. They don't capture the exhaustion of flying 3, 4, 5 missions a day for weeks on end. They don't capture the moment of seeing an enemy aircraft disintegrate under your guns and knowing that inside that aircraft was a man who had woken up that morning and thought he might live to see evening. They don't capture the 10 years in Soviet prison camps, the cold and the hunger and the mind-numbing monotony broken only by occasional brutality. They don't capture the quiet joy of holding his daughter for the first time, or the complicated peace of teaching students to fly in a world no longer at war. What they do capture, these numbers, is something simpler and more profound. They capture survival. They capture the fact that through all the chaos and violence and random chance of war, through mechanical failures and enemy fire and the simple bad luck that kills so many, Erich Hartmann kept flying and kept coming back. 16 times his aircraft failed him, and 16 times he brought it down without dying. Not because he was lucky, though luck certainly played its part. Not because he was blessed by fate or protected by divine intervention, but because he had learned, through thousands of hours in the cockpit, through countless moments of terror and decision, exactly what an aircraft could endure and exactly how to make it do what he needed it to do. The sky above the Eastern Front is quiet now, empty of the machines and men who once filled it with violence. The fields where he made his forced landings have been plowed and replanted 1,000 times. The airfields he flew from are gone, returned to farmland or forest, or in some cases, lost beneath the expansion of modern cities. The war he fought is history, studied by scholars, remembered by fewer and fewer people as the years pass and the generation that lived through it dies away. But the story remains, the story of a young man who learned to fly from his mother in gliders above a peaceful German countryside, who went to war and discovered that survival was not about heroism, but about carefulness, about planning, about knowing when to attack and when to break away, about bringing a damaged aircraft down safely for the 16th time and climbing out of the cockpit with bruises and gratitude, and the knowledge that you had been given another chance, another mission, another day. This was the gift that Erich Hartmann possessed above all others. Not the ability to destroy, though he did that with methodical efficiency. Not the ability to triumph, though his numbers speak for themselves. But the ability to endure, to survive, to keep coming back no matter how many times the aircraft tried to kill him, no matter how many times the sky itself seemed to demand his death, he kept coming back. And in the end, that is the only story that matters. The story of a man who flew through the worst war in human history and survived to tell about it.